The Nile River was the beating heart of ancient Egypt. It carried life to the desert, fed the fields, and connected the great cities of Upper and Lower Egypt. Along its waters, pharaohs traveled in splendor. Priests conducted sacred rituals, and armies moved with purpose. At the center of all this activity stood one of the most symbolic and essential creations of the ancient Egyptians, the royal barge. These were not simple boats, but floating palaces and temples. For the Egyptians, a vessel was not only a means of transport, it was also a spiritual bridge between worlds. The pharaoh's barge was a symbol of authority and divine power, a stage for ceremonies, a tool of war, and at times a vessel to carry the soul on its eternal journey. The story of the Egyptian barge is the story of Egypt itself, a civilization bound to the river, guided by ritual, and forever seeking to unite the earthly with the divine. The Nile as lifeline. In the harsh landscape of North Africa, survival depended on the Nile. Every year, the river flooded its banks, depositing fertile silt that nourished Egypt's farmlands. Without it, there could be no crops, no villages, no kingdom. The Nile was not only a source of food and trade, it was the natural highway of Egypt. From the earliest times, Egyptians learned to build boats. Papyrus rafts were among the first simple vessels for fishing and crossing the river. But as Egypt grew into a kingdom of cities and temples, its rulers demanded something greater: ships that could carry them in majesty and command the respect of their subjects. Pharaohs and divine boats. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a god on earth, the living embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra, the sun god who sailed across the sky in his own celestial boat. It was only natural that the pharaoh's journeys on the Nile mirrored the divine journeys of the gods. Every major religious festival included processions of sacred boats. The god Amun of Thebes, the goddess Hathor, or the falcon-headed Horus were carried on ceremonial barges, their gilded shrines visible to the people on the riverbanks. These events reinforced the cosmic order. Just as the gods sailed the heavens, their earthly representatives sailed the Nile. The age of great barges. By the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, shipbuilding had advanced to a remarkable degree. Pharaohs, such as Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, commanded fleets of massive wooden ships. These were not only funerary vessels, buried near pyramids to carry the pharaoh into the afterlife, but also real ships, capable of long journeys along the Nile and into foreign lands. The tradition of the royal barge continued through the Middle and New Kingdoms, reaching its height during the great imperial age of Egypt. By then, barges were colossal, richly decorated, and fitted for everything from ritual processions to military expeditions. Materials and the challenge of wood. Egypt was a land of stone, sand, and fertile soil, but not of forests. The Nile Valley produced reeds and palms, useful for small rafts, but not the large planks required for building great vessels. For this reason, shipbuilding in Egypt was both a technical and logistical challenge. To construct royal barges, Egyptian craftsmen relied on imported timber. Cedar from Lebanon, juniper from Syria, and sometimes pine from Anatolia were transported across the Mediterranean and brought up the Nile. These timbers were prized not only for their durability, but also for their symbolic associations. Cedar, in particular, was considered a noble wood, suitable for a god-king. Large planks were cut, shaped, and polished, then transported to shipyards along the Nile. There, under the blazing sun, teams of skilled laborers began the painstaking process of creating the pharaoh's floating palace. Construction methods. Egyptian ships were remarkable for their sewn plank technique. Instead of nails, which were rare and costly, shipwrights drilled holes into planks and stitched them together using ropes made from flax, hemp, or palm fiber. The seams were caulked with reeds, grass, or resin, creating watertight joints. For the largest vessels, such as the barges of the Pharaohs, wooden tenons, small rectangular pieces of wood, were inserted into mortises cut into adjoining planks. These acted like internal pegs, strengthening the hull. This method allowed the ship to flex with the movement of the water, reducing the chance of splitting. The hulls were often long and shallow, designed for the gentle but wide waters of the Nile. They featured high prows and sterns, often curved upward like the necks of animals. Some barges were decorated with gilded carvings, painted motifs, and inlaid stones, making them not only functional vessels, but also dazzling symbols of wealth and power. The Khufu ship. Perhaps the most famous example of Egyptian shipbuilding is the Khufu ship, discovered in 1954 near the Great Pyramid of Giza. Buried in a pit beside the pyramid, this vessel lay dismantled in over 1,200 pieces for nearly 4,500 years before being reassembled. The ship measures 43.6 meters, 143 feet, in length and 5.9 meters, 19.5 feet in width, enormous for its time. Built of cedar wood, it demonstrates both the artistry and the technical mastery of Old Kingdom shipwrights. The hull was sewn together with ropes, without a single metal nail. Though found as a funerary vessel, the Khufu ship shows signs of having been used in water. Some scholars believe it carried the pharaoh's body during his funeral procession. Others suggest it symbolized his eternal journey with the sun god Ra. Either way, it remains a masterpiece of ancient engineering, preserved almost perfectly across millennia. Size and structure of Pharaoh's barges. By the New Kingdom, the barges of pharaohs such as Ramses II were immense and richly adorned. Some descriptions from inscriptions suggest vessels up to 60 meters long, with multiple decks. These ships were fitted with large square sails, painted with symbolic designs, and propelled by dozens of rowers seated along the sides. The decks were wide enough to carry shrines, statues of gods, or even small temples. Some barges were fitted with ceremonial pavilions, shaded by canopies and hung with linen, where the pharaoh could sit in state, visible to all as the barge glided down the river. Decoration and symbolism. Egyptian barges were more than machines. They were sacred objects. Their decoration carried profound symbolism. Lotus and papyrus motifs linked the vessel to the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. Solar discs and falcon wings connected the pharaoh with Ra and Horus. Animal head prows, shaped like lions, falcons, or bulls, invoked divine protection. Gold leaf, bright pigments, and inlaid gems turned these ships into floating treasures. When they appeared on the Nile during festivals, they shimmered in the sunlight, a dazzling sight meant to impress both mortals and gods. Dimensions and proportions. The size of Egyptian royal barges varied depending on the era and the purpose of the vessel, but many were impressive even by modern standards. The Khufu ship, at over 43 meters long, provides one of the best surviving examples of large-scale Egyptian shipbuilding. Later, New Kingdom inscriptions suggest that ceremonial barges could exceed 50 to 60 meters, with high sides and multiple decks, making them some of the largest wooden vessels of the ancient world. The hulls were long and shallow, designed for the calm waters of the Nile rather than the open sea. This made them perfect for ceremonial display and for transporting heavy loads, including obelisks, statues, or even stone blocks for temples. Propulsion, oars and sails. Egyptian barges relied on a combination of rowers and sails. Oars, dozens of rowers, often up to 30 or more per side on the largest ships, provided steady propulsion and maneuverability. These rowers were sometimes soldiers, workers, or ceremonial crews, depending on the occasion. In ritual processions, the rowing itself had a rhythmic, almost musical quality, echoing the harmony of divine order. Sails. A single, large square sail, usually made from woven linen, was mounted on a central mast. The sail caught the prevailing north wind, allowing the barge to travel south against the current of the Nile. When moving north with the current, oars were sufficient, making the combination both practical and elegant. The sight of a gilded barge with its white sail billowing in the wind must have been one of the most awe-inspiring spectacles on the Nile. Crew and roles. The crew of a pharaonic barge could number several dozen to over 100 men, depending on the size of the vessel and its purpose. Their duties were carefully organized. Rowers provided propulsion when wind was absent or during ceremonial journeys. Sail handlers raised, lowered, and adjusted the great linen sail. Helmsmen used large steering oars at the stern to guide the ship. Guards or soldiers stood watch, especially during military campaigns or when the pharaoh himself was on board. Priests. On ritual barges, priests performed hymns, chants, and offerings during the voyage. Royal retinue, courtiers, scribes, fan-bearers, and attendants traveled with the pharaoh, ensuring that every journey reflected his divine status. Speed and performance. These were not war galleys designed for rapid pursuit or naval combat. Pharaoh's barges were majestic and deliberate, built for ceremony, stability, and endurance. Their speed was moderate, perhaps 5 to 7 knots under oars, faster when the wind favored their sails. But speed was not the goal. The slow, stately pace of a royal procession was itself symbolic, embodying permanence, majesty, and the eternal rhythm of the cosmos. Innovations and uniqueness. Egyptian shipwrights developed several distinctive features. Sewn construction. By binding planks with rope rather than nails, ships remained flexible, ideal for the Nile's shifting currents. High prows and sterns, shaped in elegant curves, often decorated with divine symbols, giving the ship an unmistakable silhouette. Shrine or pavilion decks. Many barges carried a sacred structure, either a shrine for a god or a canopy for the pharaoh, transforming the vessel into a floating temple. Solar symbolism. The very shape of the barge echoed the solar bark of Ra, linking earthly journeys with cosmic ones. Comparison with other ancient ships. Unlike Greek triremes or Phoenician trading ships, Egyptian barges were not built for high seas or long-distance warfare. Their greatness lay in ceremony and river mastery. They were both practical, transporting heavy monuments and royal entourages, and profoundly spiritual, embodying Egypt's vision of kingship as a cosmic institution. Where other civilizations built ships as tools, Egypt built them as symbols, extensions of the temple, stages for divine rituals, and vessels that united life, death, and eternity. Ceremonial processions on the Nile. The most striking use of the pharaoh's barges was in grand religious and state ceremonies. The Nile became a stage where gods and kings revealed themselves to the people. During festivals, sacred statues of deities were placed within gilded shrines carried aboard barges. The Opet festival of Thebes, for example, saw the god Amun statue carried from Karnak temple to Luxor temple aboard a ceremonial ship, accompanied by chanting priests, musicians, and offerings. The barge glided down the river, paralleled by smaller escort boats, filled with rowers, priests, and citizens, while crowds lined the banks to watch in reverence. In these moments, the pharaoh's presence on the barge symbolized divine harmony. The sight of the golden pavilion, flanked by fluttering banners and guarded by armed men, was both political theater and spiritual affirmation. Egypt was united under one god-king, carried upon the eternal river. Funerary journeys. The connection between barges and the afterlife was profound. Pharaoh's funerals often involved symbolic voyages across the Nile. The body of the king was placed on a specially prepared funerary barge, draped in linen and guarded by priests. The most dramatic expression of this idea is the solar bark, the belief that the dead pharaoh sailed with Ra, the sun god, through the heavens. The massive funerary ships buried near pyramids, such as the Khufu ship, were intended to serve as vehicles for this cosmic voyage. These barges were not simply metaphors. They were real, functional vessels, carefully dismantled and buried so that the king might sail forever. Military expeditions. Though primarily ceremonial, barges and large ships also served military functions. Egyptian inscriptions describe pharaohs leading fleets into Nubia or down to the delta to suppress uprisings. A pharaoh's presence aboard his gilded war barge was meant to inspire troops and terrify enemies. These were not war galleys like those of later Greek or Roman fleets, but rather command ships. They carried soldiers, banners, and the pharaoh himself, who directed the campaign. Escort vessels provided speed and force, while the royal barge served as a floating throne of command. Voyages of exploration and trade. Egyptian barges were also used for long journeys, carrying precious cargoes across distant waters. The most famous of these were the expeditions to Punt, a mysterious land south of Egypt, often identified with modern Eritrea or Somalia. Inscriptions from the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, 15th century BCE, describe fleets sailing down the Red Sea to Punt, returning with exotic goods: incense, ebony, ivory, gold, and even live myrrh trees to plant in Egyptian soil. The pharaoh's barges may not have crossed open seas unaided, but they formed the centerpiece of these voyages, transporting treasures and serving as ceremonial vessels of triumph upon return. Transport of monuments. Another extraordinary use of Egyptian barges was the transportation of colossal stone monuments. Obelisks, statues, and even whole temple components were moved by water. Reliefs from the reign of Hatshepsut depict massive ships carrying obelisks from quarries at Aswan to Karnak, sometimes weighing over 300 tons. Such feats required enormous engineering skill. Barges were specially constructed with reinforced hulls and wide decks to balance the immense weight. Teams of hundreds of rowers guided them downriver, while smaller boats helped maneuver the colossal loads into harbors. These voyages turned the Nile into an artery of monumental architecture, allowing the wonders of Egypt to rise from riverbanks across the land. Daily and royal use. Not every barge was reserved for death or conquest. Pharaohs used their ships in daily life as well, traveling between palaces, inspecting construction projects, or journeying to temples. These more modest barges still carried canopies and decorations. For every appearance of the pharaoh was a ritual of kingship. Even in mundane use, the royal barge was a message. The king was present, visible, and moving in harmony with the river that sustained all life. The processions of the gods. Among the most famous events involving Egyptian barges were the great religious festivals that transformed the Nile into a sacred stage. The Opet festival in Thebes was perhaps the most spectacular. Each year, the statue of Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple aboard a ceremonial barge known as the Userhat Amun, or strong-bowed bark of Amun. This barge, decorated with gold and painted with divine symbols, was rowed along the river amid the sounds of drums, flutes, and chants. Smaller boats flanked it, carrying priests and soldiers, while citizens crowded the banks to witness the journey. To the people, the sight was both political and cosmic. Their god, their king, and their world were in perfect order, moving together upon the eternal river. The voyage of Hatshepsut to Punt, one of the most legendary naval expeditions in Egyptian history, was organized by Queen Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE. Inscriptions at her temple in Deir el-Bahari show great ships sailing south to Punt, carrying gifts and returning with exotic treasures. Though these ships were designed for the Red Sea rather than the Nile, the Queen's ceremonial barge played a symbolic role in the celebrations upon their return. The triumphal procession on the Nile, with Hatshepsut herself overseeing the unloading of incense, ivory, and myrrh, was immortalized in stone reliefs. These scenes demonstrate how barges were not only practical vessels, but also central to royal propaganda, showcasing Egypt's reach across the known world. Catastrophes on the Nile. The Nile was generous, but it could also be treacherous. In the dry season, sandbanks could strand vessels, while floods could overturn even large ships. There are scattered records of barges capsizing during ceremonies or transport voyages, though details are often lost to time. One tale speaks of a royal barge struck by a sudden storm while transporting a statue of Osiris. The statue was recovered, but the barge sank, later mythologized as a symbolic death and rebirth of the god. Such events blurred the line between history and myth, turning accidents into sacred narratives that reinforced Egypt's theology of cycles. The solar boats of Ra beyond earthly events, Egyptian mythology was filled with stories of divine barges. The most famous was the solar bark of Ra, the sun god who sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Each dawn, Ra's barge emerged renewed, carrying the light of life. Each night, it faced monsters such as the serpent Apophis, whose attempts to swallow the boat symbolized chaos threatening the cosmic order. Pharaohs were seen as companions of Ra on this eternal voyage. Their funerary barges, buried near pyramids and temples, were not just practical vessels, but also symbolic counterparts of the solar boat, ensuring the ruler's safe passage into eternity. Ramses II and the Festival of Victory inscriptions describe Ramses II, the great warrior pharaoh, returning in triumph after the Battle of Kadesh. His barge sailed down the Nile adorned with banners, filled with musicians and priests, while crowds acclaimed him as a living god. Though the battle itself had been indecisive, the spectacle on the Nile turned it into a victory in the eyes of the people. Here we see the genius of the barge. It transformed politics into theatre. Victory was not only won on the battlefield, but also displayed, celebrated, and consecrated on the waters of the Nile. Legends preserved in art and tombs. Paintings and carvings found in tombs depict barges with high prows and lavish cabins, carrying both kings and gods. Some scenes show the deceased sailing into the afterlife on a papyrus skiff, while others portray massive ships with rows of oars and glowing sails. These images reinforce the idea that life, death, and eternity were all bound by the river and the boat. In a sense, every Egyptian expected to sail on a final barge, if not in reality, then in spirit. The pharaoh's barge was only the grandest expression of this universal belief. Symbols of kingship. The pharaoh's barge was more than wood, rope, and sail. It was a vessel of kingship, a floating throne that made the abstract concept of divine authority visible to the people. Every appearance of the royal barge on the Nile was a performance of power. The shimmering gold, the rows of disciplined rowers, the shrine-like pavilion where the king sat beneath a canopy. All declared that the ruler was not merely human, but the earthly embodiment of cosmic order. The people gathered on riverbanks did not simply see a king passing by. They saw the gods themselves reflected in his vessel as the barge moved in rhythm with the eternal flow of the Nile. In this way, barges became one of the most potent symbols of Egypt's political and spiritual identity. Literature and sacred texts. Egyptian texts often describe the voyages of gods in sacred boats. Hymns to Amun spoke of his journeys across the river during festivals. The Book of the Dead envisioned the soul sailing across the waters of the underworld in boats guided by divine ferrymen. In myths, the pharaoh joined the gods aboard their barges, ensuring his immortality and his role as guardian of order Ma'at. To the Egyptian mind, to sail was to live, and to continue sailing after death was to live forever. Archaeological discoveries. The greatest testimony to Egypt's shipbuilding comes not from texts alone, but from archaeology. The Khufu ship, discovered in 1954 beside the Great Pyramid, remains one of the most extraordinary finds in the history of Egyptology. Its cedar planks, carefully dismantled and buried in a sealed pit, revealed the sophistication of Old Kingdom craftsmanship. Other discoveries include smaller funerary boats buried beside pyramids and temples, some preserved so well that their ropes and oar holes remain intact. Wall reliefs from Luxor, Karnak, and Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari depict colossal ships carrying obelisks or statues, offering visual evidence of feats once thought impossible. Underwater archaeology in the Mediterranean has also uncovered remnants of Egyptian vessels, some of which may have carried cargoes to Byblos or Pont. Together, these finds confirm that Egypt's barges were both functional ships and sacred machines of state. Influence on later cultures. The idea of divine or royal barges did not end with Egypt. Later civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East adopted similar practices. In Mesopotamia, sacred boats were used in processions of gods like Marduk. The Greeks and Romans incorporated barge processions into festivals, and Cleopatra herself famously turned her royal barge into a symbol of spectacle, described by ancient writers as a floating palace of gold, silver, and purple sails. Egypt's vision of the barge as both transport and temple thus lived on, shaping cultural imagination for centuries. Modern reconstructions and memory. In modern times, Egypt's royal barges continue to fascinate. Museums in Cairo and Giza preserve fragments and reconstructions of ancient ships, allowing visitors to glimpse the grandeur of these vessels. The Khufu ship, carefully reassembled, stands as a silent witness to a 4,500-year-old world, where wood, rope, and faith combine to create a masterpiece. In 2021, a remarkable event echoed the ancient festivals: the Golden Parade of Pharaohs in Cairo. Mummies of Egypt's ancient kings and queens were transferred to a new museum aboard specially designed vehicles styled like royal barges. Though on wheels instead of water, the symbolism was unmistakable. The pharaohs still journeyed in splendor, their legacy carried forward into the modern world. Eternal resonance. The pharaohs' barges remind us that ships are more than machines. They are vessels of culture, memory, and imagination. In the slow, steady rhythm of oars against the Nile, the Egyptians saw reflections of eternity. In the sight of a golden pavilion gliding upon the water, they saw the meeting of earth and heaven. For the pharaoh, the barge was a throne, a temple, and a promise of eternal life. For us, it remains a bridge to the past, a reminder that even in the desert sands of Egypt, it was the river and the ships that sailed upon it that carried a civilization to greatness. The story of Egypt's royal barges is not only about boats, it is about how a civilization imagined its place in the universe. The pharaohs built pyramids to touch the sky, temples to honor the gods, and barges to sail between worlds. Through ceremonies, expeditions, and myths, these vessels expressed Egypt's deepest truths: that the river was life, that the king was divine, and that every journey was part of a cosmic cycle. Today, standing before the Khufu ship or gazing at temple reliefs of gilded barges, we can almost hear the chants of priests, the beat of drums, the dip of oars into the Nile. We can imagine a golden barge moving slowly through the sunlight, a pharaoh beneath a canopy, and the people of Egypt watching in awe. The barges of the pharaohs were not only ships of wood and rope, they were ships of eternity, vessels that carried a civilization across the waters of time.